High on the edge of town, shielded by towering iron gates and windows draped in dust, sat the mansion of Norman Brown, a man whispered about more than he was ever seen. For decades, the house loomed like a shadow over the neighborhood, a relic of old money and questionable dealings. Rumors swirled: sudden wealth, vanishing associates, late-night visitors who never returned. The house was his fortress, his mask, and his tomb. But when investigators finally stepped inside, they discovered things so twisted, so unsettling, that the legend of Norman Brown's mansion took on a life of its own. What exactly was hidden in those rooms, and why had no one spoken of it until now? The story of Norman Brown's mansion begins not with the house, but with the man himself. Born in 1942, Norman grew up in privilege, but never in peace. His family's fortune came from steel and shipping, industries that made his grandfather a titan in the 1920s. But Norman's childhood was marked by shadows. His father, Charles Brown, was a stern figure known for his ruthless dealings, and Norman was often left to wander the mansion's cavernous halls in silence, shaping a boy more comfortable with solitude than society. From an early age, Norman unsettled those around him. Teachers called him brilliant but detached. Neighbors recalled his piercing stare and the way he seemed to watch more than participate. When his younger brother drowned during a family vacation, Norman's calm indifference whispered of something darker. By the time his father died in a hunting accident in the late 1970s, rumors already swirled about the strange heir. Inheriting both the fortune and the estate, Norman wasted no time retreating from the public eye. Unlike his ancestors, who flaunted their wealth in society galas, he had no interest in appearances. The iron gates of the mansion closed, and they rarely opened again. The mansion itself, once a crown jewel with 20 rooms, a chandeliered ballroom, and magazine-worthy gardens, soon slipped into decay. Gardeners were dismissed, hedges grew wild, and vines clutched at its stone walls. Yet silence was never complete. At night, neighbors saw lights flicker in abandoned rooms, heard faint music drift through the air, and noticed deliveries arriving at odd hours, boxes too large for one man. Over time, the mansion became a myth. Children dared one another to touch the rusting gates, whispering of curses and hidden dungeons. Adults speculated about blackmail, laundering, or occult rituals. But none pressed too hard. Norman had influence, ties to judges, bankers, even police chiefs who seemed to look the other way. By the 1990s, his fortune had mysteriously doubled even as his businesses faltered. Admiration gave way to suspicion. Where did the money come from? Why did he isolate himself? And what lay behind those shuttered windows? The truth, when it finally emerged, would be darker than anyone imagined. The mansion's silence was not emptiness. It was concealment. Norman Brown was never a man who invited company. He moved like a shadow through the city, attending meetings with politicians behind closed doors, dining at restaurants only after their kitchens were emptied, and signing deals through intermediaries who often vanished just as quickly as they had appeared. His wealth seemed to regenerate from ashes. Businesses that collapsed in public silence somehow left him richer, never poorer. He was a man of contradictions. To those who knew him in fleeting moments, he appeared polite, cultured, and almost fragile. His voice was soft, his gestures precise, his words measured. But beneath that veneer was a man who controlled others through fear. Former employees, few who dared to speak, described him as manipulative, a master at playing one hand against another. Yet it wasn't merely financial dealings that cloaked Norman in suspicion. Over the years, individuals tied to him in one way or another disappeared. An accountant who questioned a set of offshore transfers was never seen again after driving home late one night. A business partner who refused to sign a suspicious contract was reported missing on a boating trip. Even within his own family, deaths piled up with chilling coincidence. His younger brother, supposedly drowned. A cousin, car crash under strange circumstances. All linked to Norman, all buried under official reports that seemed almost too neatly tied. And yet, no one ever confronted him directly. His mansion was his shield, his privacy, his weapon. Journalists who attempted to dig too deeply into his affairs received anonymous threats, often accompanied by photographs of their children, their homes, their daily routines. One by one, they fell silent. Norman, however, seemed untouched by the fear he inspired. On the rare occasions he appeared in public, he wore the expression of a man amused by the world's curiosity, as though he alone held the punchline to a joke no one else understood. He was, to many, a riddle without a solution. But secrets have weight. And Norman Brown's secrets grew heavier by the year. When he abruptly stopped appearing altogether, no sightings, no meetings, no sound from the mansion, the silence became too much to ignore. People whispered that he had finally met his own fate. Others insisted he was still inside, hiding, watching, waiting. The police, however, saw something else, an opportunity. When a legal technicality gave them the right to enter the mansion under suspicion of foul play, they did not hesitate. They had no idea what they were about to step into. The final unraveling of Norman Brown's empire began with a single phone call. It was a neighbor, a retired woman who lived across the street, who first noticed something strange. For weeks, the mailbox overflowed. Packages stacked on the porch were left untouched, and the only movement was the scurrying of stray cats across the overgrown lawn. No cars entered, no voices emerged. The mansion seemed more abandoned than ever. At first, the neighbors thought little of it. Norman had been reclusive for years, after all. But as the days stretched into months, murmurs turned into unease. One night, a pair of delivery men recounted hearing something from inside. A scream muffled, then silence. They never returned. The breaking point came when a groundskeeper, one of the few who still worked the property once a month, reported something unsettling to the authorities. While trimming back vines near the basement windows, he swore he smelled something rotting. The stench was faint but unmistakable, and when he pressed his ear to the glass, he claimed he heard the faint hum of machinery still running. By then, Norman had not been seen in over 8 months. The police had dismissed earlier reports, writing them off as paranoia from neighbors who read too many crime novels. But the smell was undeniable. Combined with his history of questionable dealings and the sheer strangeness of the property, officials finally sought a warrant. When word spread that the police would enter the mansion, the neighborhood gathered at the gates, hungry for spectacle, terrified of truth. The mansion had been silent for decades, and now it would speak. The night of the raid, squad cars lined the street. Floodlights turned the old estate into a stage, casting long shadows across the cracked driveway. Officers pried the gates open and marched toward the doors. The locks were rusted, yet resistant, as though they had not been touched in years. With a battering ram, the silence was broken. What the first officers saw as they stepped into the mansion would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Dust lay thick over velvet furniture. Cobwebs draped chandeliers like funeral veils, but the air itself was wrong. Heavy, charged. Somewhere deeper inside, machines hummed, faint but constant, as if the house itself still lived. And then came the smell. Stronger, sharper, undeniable. The officers exchanged looks. Something, or someone, was waiting in the belly of that house. They had opened the doors to Norman Brown's secrets, but they were far from prepared for what they were about to find. The foyer spilled into a long corridor, doors lining both sides like sentries. Some stood ajar, showing parlors frozen in dust, crystal decanters, warped rugs, portraits whose eyes followed. But 4 doors were different, bolted, padlocked, as if Norman feared one lock could not contain what was inside. The library fell first. Books towered to the ceiling, many hollowed to hide reels of film, cash, and cassettes labeled with initials and dates. An entire wall map stretched with red string connecting names, accounts, properties, a spider's web of Norman's empire. Upstairs, the second room was darker. Blacked-out windows, a slit along the wall for spying, monitors humming under a wool blanket. In the closet, a hidden passage revealed itself, a secret artery, well worn, for someone who crawled silently through the house. The third lock broke to reveal a child's room, peeling wallpaper of balloons and ships, a crib under a stained sheet. No toys, only chalk notches climbing the doorframe, stopping halfway. In the silence, a mobile creaked twice, though no air stirred. On the floor, a scuffed circle from endless pacing. It wasn't a child's room, it was a shrine to absence. At the end of a damp corridor stood the last door, steel, fitted with a keypad worn smooth from repeated touch. While waiting for the specialist, officers discovered a vent with loose screws, a floorboard hiding a velvet pouch of small human teeth. When the lock surrendered, the steel door groaned open. A stairwell dropped steeply, its steps charred at the edges, breathing air metallic and sour, tinged with bleach and rust. Lights shone into the throat of concrete, walls reinforced with rebar, seams sealed. Whatever was below had been meant to be contained. Slowly, boots rang against the steps, radios crackled, and hearts pounded. For decades, the locks had guarded Norman Brown's secrets. Now they formed a breadcrumb trail into the darkest heart of his design. The raid began like a siege, ending like an exorcism. By dusk, the cul-de-sac was alive with flashing blues and reds. Neighbors gathered behind tape, reporters holding their breath. The mansion loomed like a corpse, its blind windows waiting. The first strike of the ram cracked the silence like a gunshot. Inside, procedure warred with unease. Cameras blinked. Techs marked evidence. Rooms pretended innocence. Pianos with missing keys, portraits whose faces had been scraped away, clocks ticking just off rhythm. Yet the house twisted against its own blueprints. Closets hiding smaller closets, hallways stretching where no hallways should exist. At 10:14 p.m., the mansion stirred. A generator coughed to life. Lights flickered in empty rooms. An intercom crackled, static whispering like a ghost. The officers knew. Norman might be gone, but his systems still obeyed. 2 teams split. One traced hidden passages. The other faced the basement steel door. When the lock finally yielded, they found a switchboard labeled in careful hand. Camera A, drive. Camera B, kitchen. Room 3, observation. Only one switch glowed. Sump. Condensation slid down the concrete like a tear. By midnight, neighbors drifted home, but reporters stayed. The house was speaking. Inside, the air grew sweet and sickly, masks barely keeping the officers from gagging. The leader raised his hand, slow and steady. The stairwell narrowed, pressing inward. The smell intensified, machinery humming like a pulse through the bones. Lights licked the edge of metal, glass, tile. Then the corridor opened. An underground chamber, larger than it had any right to be, carved from earth with surgical intent. From this moment on, time split. Before, a missing man and rumors. After, the discoveries waiting below. That night would scar reports, nightmares, and memory. And it marked the instant they understood. They had not entered a crime scene. They had entered the architecture of Norman Brown's mind. The basement greeted them not with chaos, but with order. Stainless counters gleamed. Cabinets were labeled, files, archive, tools. A drain split the floor like a scar, the sump groaning below. It wasn't a dungeon. It was worse, precise. On a long table lay trophies, watches, wallets, pressed flowers in resin, photos of smiling faces. Each had initials and dates, not keepsakes, inventory. A cabinet held black notebooks. Inside, meticulous records. Subject H, resistant at first. Compliance improved with isolation. Not confessions, experiments. In the center, a retrofitted dentist's chair sat bolted to the floor, straps drooping like dead snakes. A shelf bore blindfolds, headphones, a metronome, tools of control. A back door led to freezers, frost clinging to the handles. Inside, vials neatly labeled, blood or worse. Another freezer held hundreds of tapes, reels stacked beside an old recorder waiting like it never stopped working. Beyond, a tunnel sloped downward, walls sweating moisture. Hooks lined the sides, empty but imprinted. The passage ended in a crude chamber. Tarps, broken chains, a rusted cot with a blanket folded tight. Order clung even here, in ruin. On a scarred wooden table lay a ledger, heavy as stone. Pages filled with names, dates, cities, some marked with red dots. The officer counting whispered the number, then fell silent. The basement didn't scream. It murmured. It said, "This was planned. This continued. This was not madness, but method." When the call finally reached the surface, the crowd outside felt it. An invisible shift. Reporters straightened. Neighbors crossed their arms against a sudden chill. Norman Brown's house had spoken at last. But questions still lingered, sharp as the metallic taste of fear. Where did the tunnel end? What else waited in the dark? And how many names in that ledger had stories still unfinished? By the time dawn smeared pale light over the neighborhood, the mansion had begun to disgorge its hoard. Officers carried out boxes, evidence bags, carefully wrapped objects that seemed ordinary until one remembered the context in which they'd been found. Jewelry glittered dully beneath plastic seals, gold dulled by fingerprints that could never be cleaned away. Photographs, vacations, weddings, school portraits, each with a different smiling face, each pulled from a family's missing chapter. There were coins, stamps, rare manuscripts, the kind of collection that would have seemed like the fruits of a wealthy man's eccentricity had they not been stacked alongside ledgers that tracked disappearances like balance sheets. The real shock came when the team opened a vault concealed behind a false wall in the wine cellar. What appeared at first to be rows of vintage bottles were, on closer inspection, containers mislabeled and resealed. Some held currency from countries Norman had never visited publicly. Bundles of yen, lira, dinar, crisp and uncirculated. Others concealed rolls of film stock and photographic slides, meticulously catalogued. Many showed only landscapes, highways, or storefronts. Yet on the backs, dates and names. These were surveillance images, fragments of lives observed and recorded without consent, some belonging to people long declared missing. One officer described the vault as a museum of possession. Norman had not merely collected wealth, he had collected evidence of control. Every item was a reminder that he had touched, altered, or ended a life. To keep these things was not mere arrogance, it was worship of his own power. Worse still were the tapes. Packed into old cigar boxes, they bore handwritten labels. Session 1, Session 2, Subject F. The audio was too corrupted to play on scene, but the few seconds tested were enough. Muffled voices, strained breathing, the hum of the same metronome found in the basement. Each tape was a fragment of an unthinkable ritual. But even among all this, one discovery gnawed at investigators more than the rest. Inside a hidden drawer within the vault, they found a series of ornate lockets, each containing a strand of hair, sometimes two. Every locket bore initials etched so finely they could almost be missed. When cross-referenced with the ledger from the basement, the initials matched. The dots beside certain names in the ledger seemed to correspond with these tokens, as if Norman had developed his own private language of conquest. The mansion was no longer simply a house filled with horrors. It was a reliquary. The objects spoke of Norman's need not just to control, but to preserve his legacy in fragments. Each one proof that he had reached into the intimate details of a person's existence and claimed a piece of them. By the time the vault was emptied, the police knew this was bigger than a disappearance. It was bigger than Norman himself. The treasures he had hoarded were not merely evidence. They were echoes of lives stolen, frozen, and arranged as carefully as art. And yet, one question lingered heavier than all. If this was what Norman chose to keep, what had he chosen to destroy? For years, the mansion had loomed over the town like a watchtower, but few dared to voice what they sensed. After the raid, the neighbors spoke more freely, confessing whispers and half-seen moments that, in hindsight, drew a chilling picture. There was Mrs. Harding, who lived 2 doors down. She remembered the nights when trucks arrived at 3 in the morning, engines idling with their lights off, men unloading crates that seemed too heavy for just supplies. She said she once glimpsed Norman himself, standing by the gates, dressed in black despite the sweltering summer, his face lit briefly by a passing headlight, expressionless, like a statue. Then there was young Daniel, who, as a boy, had climbed the mansion's stone wall on a dare. He swore he saw a figure pacing the second-floor hallway, pausing to stare out of a window that should have been dark. He scrambled down in terror, insisting the eyes he saw did not belong to a man, but something hollowed out. His friends laughed, but he never approached the property again. The mailman, now retired, admitted he had often delivered envelopes from faraway places, Romania, Argentina, Morocco, always marked personal, always untraceable once they entered the gates. Once, after a package went missing, Norman himself appeared at the post office, his calm voice carrying an edge that made the clerk tremble. The missing parcel was never mentioned again, and the most unsettling confession came from a former housekeeper. She worked only 6 months in the 1980s before leaving without explanation. Under oath, she revealed she had been forbidden from entering the West Wing. Once, when curiosity overtook her, she opened a door just a crack. She saw a room filled with cages, not for animals, but sized unnervingly for people. Before she could process the sight, Norman appeared behind her, his hand heavy on her shoulder, his voice a whisper. "Some doors stay closed." She resigned the next morning. Neighbors also remembered the sound. Faint, irregular, carried on still nights. The hum of machinery underground, sometimes joined by a metallic clanging, sometimes by what sounded too much like a human cry quickly stifled. They told themselves it was plumbing, old pipes, the moans of a dying house. But deep down, they knew better. When the revelations from inside became public, the neighborhood felt cursed. Homes that once sold for fortunes were suddenly unwanted. Children grew up under the shadow of the mansion's story, carrying nightmares passed from parents. And though the house stood still and silent once Norman was gone, its presence whispered that evil had not left. It had merely been unearthed. The Brown family had been considered aristocracy in their corner of the world. Norman's grandfather, Edward Brown, built the shipping empire that gave rise to the fortune, and his father, Charles, expanded into steel. The mansion was their crown jewel, intended to showcase prosperity. But as investigators pulled at the threads, they found rot woven into the tapestry from the start. Edward Brown had faced allegations of smuggling in the 1930s, though none ever stuck. Whispers suggested that during Prohibition, the family made more profit from liquor than from steel. When Charles inherited the business, lawsuits trailed him. Wrongful deaths in factories, workers crushed in unsafe conditions, settlements quietly paid under the table. Yet the Browns always emerged untouched, shielded by money and connections. Norman's childhood was no less haunted. Teachers remembered a quiet, brilliant boy with eyes that seemed too old. He excelled in numbers, but struggled with empathy, often watching his classmates as if they were puzzles rather than people. One incident, long buried, emerged in the investigation: a missing pet from a neighbor's yard. When questioned, Norman calmly suggested the animal had run away. The truth was never found, but suspicion lingered. When Charles died in his so-called hunting accident, Norman became the sole heir. The family fortune passed into his hands, and with it, the mansion that would become his fortress. But rather than preserve his father's empire, Norman dismantled it. Factories closed, businesses were sold off, yet his wealth only grew. Investigators later tied him to offshore accounts, shell companies, and dealings with figures whose names stained international watch lists. The mansion, once a beacon of family pride, became his laboratory. Where his father flaunted wealth, Norman concealed it. Where his grandfather sought status, Norman sought control. And yet, the deeper the investigation dug, the clearer it became that Norman's sins were not born in isolation. They were nurtured in a family that had always danced with shadows, each generation pushing the boundaries further until Norman stepped fully across the line. When genealogists traced the Browns' connections, they found ties to unsolved crimes spanning decades. Missing dock workers in the 1930s, unexplained fires in the 1950s, sudden bankruptcies of rivals in the 1960s, all coinciding with periods of sudden profit for the family. Norman had not betrayed the legacy. He had perfected it. The mansion was merely the last chapter in a story written long before he was born. The family crest above the mansion's grand fireplace bore the motto Fortitudo et Silentium, strength and silence. After the revelations, those words took on a chilling resonance. The Browns had been strong, and they had been silent. And in that silence, lives had been swallowed whole. When the police finally sealed the mansion, it stood not as a home, but as evidence. Every room, every object, every lock was catalogued, photographed, and boxed. Yet the questions outnumbered the answers. Where had Norman gone? Was he dead, entombed somewhere in his own labyrinth, or alive, watching from afar as his secrets unraveled? The empire he left behind crumbled swiftly. Properties linked to his name were seized, offshore accounts frozen. Families of the missing came forward, some recognizing items from the vault, others hoping against hope that a clue might point to their loved one's fate. Lawsuits erupted, not just against Norman, but against the institutions that had looked away for decades. Judges, bankers, and politicians were forced to answer uncomfortable questions about their ties to him. The mansion itself became a point of contention. Some demanded it be razed, the ground salted, as if demolition could erase its evil. Others argued it should stand as a monument, a warning of what power unchecked by conscience can become. For years, it sat untouched, its windows shattered by weather, ivy crawling over its stones, a hollow husk with the weight of unspeakable memory. Reporters descended, crafting documentaries and exposés, Urban explorers snuck inside, filming corridors that still seemed to hum with menace. Paranormal enthusiasts claimed the house was cursed, that the cries of the missing echoed through its halls. None of it restored what had been lost, but the legend of Norman Brown only grew. What remained of his empire was not wealth, nor influence, nor legacy. It was fear. It was the haunting knowledge that a man had lived among them, cloaked in respectability, while building a world beneath their feet, dedicated to control and cruelty. And in the quiet moments, when the gates creaked in the wind and the mansion loomed against the sky, one question still chilled the town to its core. Had they uncovered everything? Or had Norman Brown left behind secrets that no one had yet dared to find? Norman Brown's mansion has become more than a crime scene. It's a symbol of how darkness festers when power and silence intertwine. Behind locked doors and beneath polished floors, lives were stolen, stories were cut short, and an empire was built on fear. Now, the world knows. But what do you think? Were all of Norman's secrets truly uncovered? Or is the most disturbing discovery still waiting? Subscribe, share your thoughts, and join the conversation.